Hello, everyone. Chris Guthrie here, host of SellerCast. And in today's episode, I speak with Thomas Smale from FBAinternational.com. It's a brokerage of internet businesses. So they sell internet-based businesses, and specifically, we're talking about selling e-commerce businesses that are focused primarily on Amazon. So today's episode, if you've ever thought about selling your business or this is something that you want to do, definitely one worth listening to. So show notes are sellercast.com/12, sellercast.com/12. We'll get you those because there's a few blog posts that are mentioned as well that you want to check out too. So let's start the show, and thanks so much for tuning in. Hello, everyone. Chris Guthrie here, host of SellerCast, and today we have Thomas Smale from FE International. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Chris. Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, so I know your company. I met one of your team members at an event. Rhodium Weekend was the name of the event, 2014, I believe. It was about buying and selling online businesses, and so how long have you guys been running this company?
So we've been in business since 2010 now. We started out doing various things in the buying, selling, brokerage industry. But since 2011, 2012, we've pretty much just been focused on brokerage.
Okay. And so I know the main reason why I wanted you to come on here was to talk about selling e-commerce businesses and specifically about FBA type businesses. So any e-commerce business that's primarily focused on selling on Amazon, that's the main thing that we were going to cover. So the first question that really anyone's going to have that is thinking about selling their business is, what is it worth? What do they think that their business would be worth? Can you give some ideas in terms of what people can expect their businesses are worth?
Yeah, so valuation is a question that comes up quite often for us, and we spend a lot of time kind of focusing on the accuracy of our valuations. So I'd say, the first caveat would be it doesn't really matter if it's an Amazon business or an e-commerce business or any other business. The same factors will apply throughout. So regardless whatever business you got, you can take these points quite consistently across the board. So there are lots of different factors that do go into valuation. Our average sale in the last 12 months comes out to be about 2.7, 2.8 times the annual net income of the business. And that's based on an SDE basis, which effectively is the net profit of a business, and then what we call adding back any discretionary costs, so such as owner salary, any other benefits that the owner takes out, which is common in small business valuations. Usually anything under $1 million a year gets covered by that.
So you take out the money that people pay themselves when it comes to valuation.
Yeah. So if your business is netting say $100,000 a year, and then you're also paying yourself $100,000 a year, and then you're also taking out $20,000 in other benefits, then we would adjust it to be $220,000. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah. So that's our average. But businesses will fall. The vast majority will fall in the range of 2 to 3 times annual net, and then we'll have some that will be slightly lower than that, and some that will be higher than that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I want to dive into this in more detail, but one question I have in mind too is just what's the main motivation that you see for people wanting to sell their business? I think that some people may be listening thinking that maybe they aren't even interested in selling at this time, but maybe once they hear some of the reasons you suggest, maybe they think, hey, maybe it might be nice to take some chips off the table, so to speak.
Yeah, that's another common thing that comes up. I speak to a lot of people say, hey, I'm not even thinking about selling. A lot of times the reasons that come up are things that not necessarily have a problem with the business, but quite often people have other projects starting on the side. And because I guess just in the general economy and with an online business in general, it's quite difficult to raise capital. So quite often selling one project to reinvest in maybe a bigger project or a project the particular person finds more interesting elsewhere is quite a common reason. For whatever reason, they might not have the time anymore. So people having children, people moving country, people having just started a new job, that's quite a common one, especially with really small businesses. So under 100,000 is quite common for people. They no longer have the time to commit. I think with the general entrepreneur crowd, the main reason is just they've been running their business for a while and they want to do something else. So quite often we're just dealing with entrepreneurs who have built the business up. And for most entrepreneurs, as you know, part of the fun is just building the business up in the first place. So a lot of people enjoy building, but they don't necessarily like running. And then there are various other I guess, mitigating circumstances that come up, which is slightly more rare, but things like divorce, retirement, for whatever reason they're forced to sell, so maybe a dispute between partners. But
Mhm.
they tend to be less common. It's generally usually just they've been in running it for a while and they want to move on to something else.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I figure that yeah, like you mentioned, if an entrepreneur had the drive and motivation to start a business from scratch in the first place, then they likely still have that motivation to do it again in the future. And so yeah, eventually maybe they just get tired and they want a change and do something different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's great. Now I want to talk a little bit about the overall market for these types of businesses. But I was curious too, before we go much further, the vast majority of the people that I talk to, they're doing private label products, or they have their own brand, or they have some patent that they've done that's a unique product. But I do talk to some sellers that are doing, retail arbitrage, or they're doing wholesaling, or they're mass selling other brand products. Have you seen Amazon businesses that are selling on the market that are doing that approach, where they're doing retail arbitrage or selling other people's products, or are those more difficult to sell?
Yeah, we see a real range. I'd say retail arbitrage is less common, especially from a saleability perspective. But they don't really come up that often. In terms of selling other products, so not white labeling and not or private labeling or whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
they do come up, but with Amazon FBA specifically, not that often. If you're running like 1,000 or 2,000 SKUs, quite often they'll have their own store running, well, like on Shopify or whatever separately. Most of the Amazon FBA specific businesses might only have one product, but usually they won't have more than 10. And those products are generally just a variation on the single product. So we did a business recently that was selling like bow ties and ties. So it was basically just different colors and styles.
Mhm.
But it wasn't necessarily selling 20 different other types of clothing items or anything like that.
Okay.
So yeah, I'd say that's probably the main differentiator we see between the standard Amazon FBA business, which might be specific to one main SKU, and then a general like Shopify or big commerce store that might have thousands quite often, and then they're buying it through a wholesaler.
Interesting. Yeah, that's surprising. I figured that there would be that more FBA businesses would be beyond just an individual product with some variants. Is it just? I mean, I suppose it just depends. I mean, ultimately, but a lot of sellers I talk to, they have maybe 10, 20 products, and then they're all complementary to each other, so
Hmm.
they can do things like do promos where when you buy the other product you get 50% off of the other one, and then they can use that to try and help manipulate getting into the frequently bought together, for example.
Yeah,
And so they do stuff like that to help drive
yeah,
additional sales.
yeah. I think once you have like multiple SKUs, so people running thousands of SKUs, it does make sense to open up your own store as well.
Mm,
Whereas a lot of people start FBA businesses because they're relatively lean and easy to run. Whereas as soon as you go into running 1,000 SKUs and dealing with, say, 20 different suppliers, that's an entirely different game altogether. So
yeah.
Amazon then becomes one place you can sell. But you'll also sell through your own store, eBay,
Mm,
Facebook, paid ads. Um, yeah, so I guess the bigger stores tend to be more of a kind of a advancement on FBA. Although we have seen quite a few large FBA businesses that just have say 1 to 10 products and they still do pretty good volume without anything outside of Amazon.
okay. What's the least amount of selling history that you'd recommend before someone considers selling their business?
So this is something we look at quite a lot because we constantly get people coming to us with businesses of all ages. The lowest we tend to go in terms of businesses we will take on is about 12 months old. If it's really small, we occasionally make exceptions. We might go to businesses that are maybe 6 to 9 months old. But generally speaking, especially with FBA businesses where you can get quite a lot of momentum early on, it's quite a risky purchase for a buyer if it's only 6 months old because there's no real proof of the sustainability there. So generally at a year old, and you start getting the stronger multiples, so more towards the three times once a business hits, say, 3 years old.
Okay. And well, I know you talked about this briefly when you were discussing valuation earlier, but I'd always heard of using the trailing 12 months income and then doing an average of those months
Mhm.
to come up with a multiple. Is that also how you're typically doing?
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, it depends on the age of the business. So if a business is quite stable and has been for, say, 3 years, then the trailing 12 months is usually the most relevant way to look at it. especially then because you can take into account things like seasonality. With a business that's slightly younger and growing, we might look at, say, the most recent 3 months or the most recent 6 months, and then extrapolate them out, assuming we can argue that the sustainability is there. So that comes up more regularly with things like SaaS businesses and anything where it's recurring billing, where once you hit a certain baseline, it makes sense that it's going to continue in that
Mm.
in that manner. Whereas with an e-commerce business, let's say you started it in June and you have a really strong November and December, you can't really then extrapolate that out. So really, it really is kind of at our discretion. But generally speaking, with e-commerce businesses, especially because most of them will have an element of seasonality in there and tend to have a pretty strong Q4 for the shopping season. Usually, the last
Mhm.
12 months is the most relevant way to look at them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And then the final question I had about this, and actually I kind of want to transition into another topic, but are most of the businesses you're saying, are they owner operated, or will you suggest that people add staff to help manage their business as well? I guess the main reason why I'm trying to get at is, how do the people that are listening today make the most money possible from the sale of their business if they decide to go that route?
Yeah, so I mean, we deal with a real range of businesses, so anywhere from 20, 30,000 all up to the like $1 million and above mark. So the difference between businesses at say 30K and $2 million are kind of completely different. And generally,
Mm-hmm.
once you get above say 500,000, it's very rare to see a business without a team in place. But from a general value perspective, from a buyer perspective, the main thing they want is a business that's relatively easy for them to take over and is relatively hands off for the owner. So a business where the owner works 5 hours a week is always going to be worth more than a equivalent business where the owner's working 40 hours a week. Because generally they're going to want to work in a cost for um, like replacing them with a team member or doing the work themselves or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Um, and also from a scale perspective, if there's a team in place, it's a lot easier to scale a business where there's a existing team versus the current owner just working more hours. But I would generally recommend any tasks that can be outsourced. There are obviously some things in any business where the owner or the CEO or the manager has to be in charge of, but there are always things that can be relatively easily outsourced. So things like customer service is quite a simple one to um,
Mm-hmm.
manage out. But I mean, it really does depend. But generally speaking, a business with a team and minimal owner involvement will be more desirable or worth more than a business where the owner's doing all the work themselves, especially if there's a particular skill they might have. So if you're a I don't know, you're a qualified chef and you've got a great reputation, a really popular blog, and you're selling, say, chef's knives on Amazon and cookbooks, then that business is going to be a little bit harder to sell than the business where the owner is effectively not seen and isn't really contributing anything to the sales of the business in that respect.
Yeah, and using that example, and actually, I kind of want to touch on a few of the things you mentioned, but using that example, you'd almost have to assume if you've done some personal branding that you're going to need to be involved still for a longer time transition wise for a new buyer, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they tend to. It depends on the extent of the personal involvement. If it's entirely personal, that business is going to be quite difficult to sell. If you just happen to have a blog or a popular website in the industry that's sent some traffic or some sales, generally we just agree like an ongoing transition, which might involve keeping links from their blog to the store for the next 36 months or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But generally, we try and standardize a 1 month transition period for the buyer and seller. So, regardless of the business. Um,
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. So then, and even going back to your earlier point about anything that can be outsourced should be. And I think that's just a good point for anyone that is currently selling on Amazon and maybe they're a newer seller. I think that there's, especially for first time entrepreneurs, they have, I don't know if it's I don't know what it is, but people just feel like they can only do it perfectly themselves.
mhm,
When in fact, once you finally hire someone and they take something off your plate, you realize, how did you ever live your life without it?
mhm.
And so I think that's just another thing to really draw attention to, because people are so caught up in trying to do everything perfectly and do it just themselves that they really lose out on a lot of potential growth for their business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a lot of things. I think you hit the nail on the head with first time entrepreneurs. A lot of people find it difficult to let go. But you often find once you start hiring people that, I mean, the majority of people that work at FE International are better at their jobs than I would be. So
Mhm.
that's always something to focus on, especially from a growth perspective. One
Yes.
thing, I mean, I guess the caveat there is really if you're running a small business and it's your single source of income, then while working less hours might be great, you might not necessarily want to be spending that $1,000 a month on the customer support person if the $4,000 a month the business is making as a whole is paying your kind of rent and bills. Um, but if
Yeah.
you are really looking at it as a business rather than I guess it's like a lifestyle business or an income stream or a job replacement, then it's definitely sensible to outsource. I guess the not necessarily low value tasks, but the tasks that you don't necessarily need to be doing yourself, or someone else can do better, ideally.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So I somewhat interjected there when you were going through. What are some of the other things that help sellers get the best possible price for their business? I know I kind of interjected in the middle there.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main factors that comes into valuation is how old the business is and how predictable it is. So a 1 year old business, regardless of how strong the fundamentals might be, is always going to be more risky and have more unknowns than a business that's 5 years old. But obviously, if you're in a position where you have to sell, then you can't really do anything about the age of the business as it is. Having systems, processes, teams in place, like we just discussed, that is definitely something that helps. And even if you are running the business yourself, at least have everything written down so someone can come in and take over. You don't necessarily have to be employing people, but if you have that backup option, one issue that we kind of touched on right at the start is that, especially with Amazon FBA businesses specifically, quite often if you just have one product or a range of products in a particular vertical or space or category, then that can be quite risky because you're effectively entirely reliant on that one income stream. So the more you can diversify, you don't necessarily need to sell completely different products. There's no reason why you can't sell all within one category, but it is important to try and get away from just having that one product or one SKU, because then you can be in a situation where you could have a really popular product that has really great reviews, and then for whatever reason you could have supplier issues, and then you can be in a situation where you get a bunch of one-star reviews, and suddenly you kind of drop down the seller rankings, and you're stuck in a position
Mhm.
where you're not really selling much. So diversifying in that respect is always helpful, and the same goes for suppliers. While having one great supplier is a good thing, and there's no reason why you shouldn't buy the majority of your product through them, having a backup or ideally two is also helpful, because you find that quite often, especially I've seen a lot of e-commerce businesses where one of the reasons they're selling or one of the reasons the business hasn't been performing lately is because their current supply is having stock issues. Either like they don't have the stock or the stock's not like the same quality they've been used to in the past. And especially if you're on a using a third party platform like Amazon where reviews really are key, is quite important to make sure that if there are any issues, you can react quickly. So if you're stuck with one
Mhm.
supplier, then you can be in a position where you're kind of completely at their mercy, and you can be in a position where you might not be able to sell anything for months, or you might completely lose all of the momentum that you've built up with some really good reviews at the start. Um, other than that, I mean, I guess selling. I know we're talking about FBA businesses in general, but selling across more than one platform is also helpful. So don't just sell on Amazon. Also set up your own storefront. I think setting up your own storefront is important from a defensibility perspective, because then you can start
Mhm.
owning your own client data. So you can start building an email list. You can start running more tests. You just have a lot more control over the process. You start to build up a bit of an asset with value rather than being entirely reliant on the Amazon platform. So I think, regardless of how solid your Amazon business is, that the sales multiple is always going to be limited versus controlling your own store. Um, so I think that's definitely something to look into, especially as you start getting a little bit more established. Obviously, when you start out, you don't want to start with like 20 products, 20 different suppliers, 20 different platforms. But if you do
Yeah.
find that your one product or your 10 initial products are selling really well on Amazon, then either find some more suppliers and start selling more products on Amazon, or start diversifying to a Shopify store or something cost effective and easy to set up. So that's definitely, I would say, they're the main factors to think about.
So, kind of summarizing and putting everything together, it sounds like if you're going to be selling your FBA business, make sure you're in business for at least a year, ideally longer. So you have, I guess you could potentially be hitting a couple seasons of selling if you're, say, you have a product that's selling well during different times of the year, then you can go through two of those seasons. And then also, ideally, multiple products within that space and then multiple suppliers, just in terms of that. So that's kind of the a rough guideline you'd suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds about right.
Okay. And so then coming back to the supplier comments, you mentioned the supplier issues, and this is definitely something that, if you've been selling on Amazon, you've probably encountered an issue beyond just an issue of, oh, I forgot, I tried to order my product and it was Chinese New Year, and so it's going to take longer to get it, which is something that, again, people can make the mistake of having that happen. But are you seeing then that there's a greater demand for businesses that are using local US based suppliers as opposed to suppliers in China or other parts of the world, or is it really just it just depends?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's where the diversification really, really helps. We don't necessarily have people who, some people only want businesses where the products are produced in China. Other people only want a business with products produced in the US or Europe or whatever. So there's always a real range. And one of the things we try to do as brokers is make sure we're in a situation where we can sell a real range of businesses. But as a general point, I think having a single Chinese supplier is definitely at risk, especially to the majority of buyers in the US, because especially as the business gets bigger, the main issue being that any contracts you might have in place or any agreements you've got in place aren't really going to be legally binding or enforceable. Which on a
Mm.
small business, if you're making $50,000 a year, it's fine. But if you're trying to buy a business for $2 million, there's one Chinese supplier, and you don't really have a kind of contract in place, or any agreement you do have is just based on, oh, this is how it's always been done, then that's going to be more risky. So I think when you're diversifying, in an ideal world, try and diversify on country as well. So you might, for example, you might better buy from your Chinese supplier for $1, and your US supplier might be $1.20. So while it'd be sensible to keep buying from the Chinese supplier, having that US supplier as a backup, or maybe buying like 10% of your inventory from them, especially just to kind of keep your account open if you are in a situation where you might need a short term burst of supply that needs to get shipped like significantly quicker, even if it costs you a little bit more. Having those multiple options is always going to be a good thing. But I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that buyers will write off a business based on where the supplier is. It's mainly just
Mhm.
the commercial risk of having a single supplier versus many.
Yeah. Going back to the supplier part, though, you mentioned something about contracts. And yeah, if you're dealing with a supplier in China, then I'm going to assume that depending on the size of the business, it may be cost prohibitive to actually try and enforce that contract. I mean, do you suggest for US based suppliers for them to try and get a contract in place after a certain time of doing business with them? Or is it it's just one of those risks where there's potential supplier issues even if you buy a business that's been selling for a couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, any sort of contract you're going to have in place for the supplier, regardless wherever they are, is never really going to be overly binding in the first place. It's going to be difficult to
Yeah.
get them to guarantee you like the price of the product for the next 5 years or anything like that. But I guess the more you can get in writing, the better. But selling small businesses in general, it's quite rare for us to see really rock solid contracts in place. But I think if your business scales, especially when you get into the 6 and 7 figure range, it is important to have more formal agreements in place, um, even if it just means that with your supplier you've like signed their terms and conditions and you're like an approved reseller or whatever. That's better than kind of emailing someone once a week who then sends you an invoice and then you go pay them cash or something like that.
Yeah.
So the more formalized you can make it, the better. Um, and that's another reason why age comes into it. So a business where it's 3 years old and you've been dealing with the same supplier and you've never had an issue with stock, then that's going to be a much A buyer's not going to be so concerned about the supply risk in that business. Whereas if your business is 12 months old and you've had a month where you made no money because the supplier is out of stock, and that represents significantly more risk. So it does also really depend on the situation of the business, I guess.
Okay, that makes sense. What are some of the, because again, I think that a lot of people are listening just because of the nature of, really any market, they're newer or they're starting out selling on Amazon and they've maybe this is the first business they've considered selling. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe they've looked at selling one before. But we've talked about a lot of different factors that can influence the price, other warning signs, risks. Are there any other really common mistakes that people make before they try and sell a business in terms of maybe not record? That's probably the best example would probably be not doing a good job of accounting, for example.
Mhm.
But are there other mistakes that you see, or what are the most common ones for people that are trying to sell their
Yeah,
business?
I'd say probably the most common one, and this is a difficult one. I was speaking at an event a few weeks ago, and I was talking about this on stage, and I was trying to caveat it quite heavily because you never really know. But one of the things that comes up quite often is people just sell their business too late. So going back to some of the earlier reasons why people might sell their business, they might be in a position where they've got a new job, but quite often what people will do is they'll get 3 months into their job, they won't really spend any time on their business, and it might have gone from a nice consistent, say, $10,000 a month net, and it started to drop to like $5,000 because they haven't had any time to spend on it. So
Mhm.
if you are aware of any changes, like to your own schedule or whatever, they're going to start affecting the business, then timing the sale is really important. So that's probably the most common thing. People come to us and they're like, "Oh, the business used to do really well in 2014, 2012. I was making all this money, but this year I've been sick, or I've got a new job, or I moved, been concentrating on my new business, and the business has fallen." And while it might have done really well in the past, buyers are relatively fickle, and any short-term drops in the business are going to affect any sales price quite heavily.
Yeah, that's a great point. Never try and sell when something's on the decline. It's going to really limit your options, and so you're going to end up with a much less attractive multiple option than the 2 to 3x that you described before. I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally, we won't even take them on if they're on a decline. We generally say you want at least 3 months of stability. The worst business you can be selling is a business that's been on like a month constant decline.
Yeah,
Unless there's a really specific, if you've dropped for 1 month and then pick back up again, that's fine. Which is why if someone does come to us with a business that's falling, we'll say to them, "Hey, look, go work on the business for 3 months, stabilize it out again, and then come back and sell it."
yeah. That's a good point, and I think that it's worth repeating. If you are thinking about starting a new business or you've somewhat lost interest in the business you have, make sure that you hold on just a little bit longer before you can go through a sale process. Because otherwise, if you decide to sell afterwards, it's then you're going to end up in a huge problem. And that's something that I actually commonly see too. When people email me, they say, "Hey, I'm looking at selling this. It was doing this before, and now it's doing this much lower number." And it's like, okay, well, you should have come to me back when it was doing, that better number, and I could give you better advice. But yeah, that's great. Well, so I think we're getting pretty close to wrapping up here, but yeah, I know that you work for, or you're one of the partners at FE International, and so you guys sell businesses, and so you're a brokerage. Are there any other are there pros and cons to working with a brokerage as opposed to doing other types of platforms? I know there's a lot of different ways you can sell a business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are lots of different ways you can sell. I'd say generally speaking, where a broker starts to become more valuable to you, or of most value, is once your business is making, say, at least 20, 30,000 a year. So maybe 50,000 in value and up. So at that level, from a, a broker perspective, that's where the expertise is really going to come in, and any small deviances in value that a broker might add, either with advice before the sale or during, a small variance of say 5-10% in asking price for a $2,000 site doesn't really matter, but on a $200,000 deal it can make quite a big difference. Another thing, if you work with us, I mean, we have a success rate of 93%. Almost everything we take on we sell. So if you listen to our advice, like if you come in 6 months before you want to sell, we give you some like tips to work on. You'll then be in a position where your business is going to be a lot more sellable. From an economics perspective, if you're kind of short of time, or you're like not really sure about the process, we do all the work for you. We've got a very standardized, consistent process that works for getting businesses sold. So we'll do pretty much all the work for you, charge you a fee on completion. Whereas a lot of marketplaces out there, for example, you sell on Flipper, you have to pay a listing fee, you have to do all of the work yourself, and then you pay them 10% on completion. With us, we do all the work for you. We have a success rate of 93%, and then we charge you 10 to 15% on completion. So the actual cost isn't really, you don't really save that much more doing it yourself. And obviously, even if you are saving a little bit on the percentage, in terms of what you're going to actually get for the business, you're going to get significantly more through a broker on average. So broker multiples will beat Flipper multiples on average almost every single time. There are occasions where running a public auction might make you a little bit more because there's a chance you can get into a bidding war. Whereas with a broker, you're going to get a slightly more consistent process. But yeah, overall, a broker is usually going to be better value than a marketplace overall, with all the work that you get as well, and just the experience. I guess also making it a slightly more objective process. So we're not going to kind of bullshit you through the process. We want you to sell the business, get as much as possible for it, take a lot of the emotion out of it. I think when you're selling a business yourself, you can be quite emotionally tied to it, and you can start making rash decisions, saying the wrong things. So it definitely helps to have an experienced broker on a call.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's great. And I mean, so for people that are listening, part of the reason why I wanted you to come on and speak is I found your site, and then, well, first of all, I knew your team from the last time I met them back in October 2014. And then also I saw that you put out some great content on selling an Amazon FBA business, e-commerce business due diligence. And so I'll link to those articles in the show notes. And so I just wanted to kind of elaborate on some of those topics and just give people that are thinking about selling their business, or maybe they're not thinking about it and they're just now curious, okay, what could I do if I wanted to sell it? Some ideas that they can use for when that time comes. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks very much. Hope that was helpful.
All right, and that was the show. You can check out the show notes by going to sellercast.com/12 to look at a few of the blog posts that I mentioned. And you can also go to sellercast.com/3 if you'd like to listen to an interview I did with my friend Corey, who built and sold not one, but two Amazon-specific e-commerce businesses for a total of $365,000 in cash. So sellercast.com/3 to check that one out as well. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.